Hello everyone, today we get back to our historical regional series and we talk about Croatia in personal union with Hungary during the High and the Late Middle Ages. Right? The personal union between the Kingdom of Croatia and the Kingdom of Hungary, established in 1102, as we've seen also in our videos about the First Duchy and the Kingdom of Croatia, marked a pivotal shift in the political organization of the region. It followed the death of the last native Croatian ruler from the Trpimirovic line, a dynasty that had governed the medieval Croatian kingdom since the 9th century, with roots traceable to figures like Saint Duke Trpimir. We again already covered these topics. If anything, we will come back more specifically or thematically on them, but the basics are already laid as a foundation for our historical regional series. More precisely, after the short and ineffectual rule of Stephen II, the final king of that dynasty who died without an heir at the beginning of 1091, the realm of the Croats plunged into full civil unrest. The ensuing succession crisis, compounded by external pressures from Venice seeking Adriatic commercial dominance, and the same Constantinople asserting claims over Dalmatian territories with their strategic ports and islands, created conditions in which Croatian nobles sought stability through alignment with the Arpad dynasty, the ruling house of Hungary founded by Grand Prince Arpad in the late 9th century. Right, if you want to learn a bit more about this, we have, especially from Serbian history, sort of a lot of parallel and description of these eras and the relations with the Croats, with the Slavonia, and mostly revolving around Dalmatia. We have to talk much more about Venetian history in this specific period, which is really important, but also about Croatia in general. Right? I want to talk about the Uskoks. I want to sort of start picturing, especially also a certain specific involvement and resistance against the Ottomans in modern warfare. Widow Queen Helen, sister of the Hungarian King Ladislaus I and widow of the late Demetrius Zvonimir, tried to retain influence during this turbulent time. At the end of the 11th century, if you're interested, by the way, in the Byzantine projection of power towards Dalmatia, you can look at the Battle of the Iraqian that I made. Also the videos about warfare between Constantinople and the Normans, and also any video about the Komnenian era, because as you know, at that point, the Byzantines came back prepotently in the Adriatic. Now, back to Queen Helen, some nobles around her, possibly from the Guzic or Lapchan families, or figures like Vinia of the Lapchan line, among the ancient Croatian noble lineages with long-standing territorial holdings in regions like Krbava and the Zadar hinterland, invited Ladislaus to aid her and claim the throne through inheritance rights linked to her Arpad marriage. Thus, in 1091, Ladislaus himself crossed the Drava river and easily took control of Slavonia. That we have to sort of distinguish a bit better here, maybe in a dedicated video, like between what we'll delve as Croatia and Serbia. You have Bosnia, etc. There are different areas that sort of are also a matter of ethnic dispute for sort of other historical regions. But we've seen essentially how the Balkan hinterland in particular was very scarcely sort of stabilized in some political territorial patterns. Probably much less actually than we think. Meaning that certain polities that eventually develop into be particular states today, even if you think about, Bosnia, so did actually exist from a longer time than we normally think. But the recognition and by which standards is always a matter of debate. At least whenever I make these videos on Schwerpunkt, you get a lot of comments that sometimes are useful for the angst, etc., for the algorithmic drive, but some of them are just completely paranoid. I would say that's a symptom of some mental disturbance. In any case, Ladislaus at this point moved without encountering opposition. However, his campaign halted near the Iron Mountains, or Mount Gvozd, a strategic reach in central Croatia that historically served, in fact, as a natural boundary between northern and southern territories. Ladislaus appointed his nephew, Prince Almos, to administer the controlled areas and founded the Diocese of Zagreb as a symbol of his new authority. Right? Ecclesiastical administration was key to political territorial stabilization. Yet he faced, obviously, resistance and was forced to withdraw due to Cuman attacks, which were likely stirred by Constantinople, by the way, as a part of broader regional rivalries involving steppe nomadic allies. Right? The point, as we will see today also, is that even though Croatia is associated with Hungary, it always remained an autonomous land. It was not part of the Kingdom of Hungary. Right? This was just a dependency of the Crown of Hungary. And this is interesting because actually there were some parts of the Hungarian kingdom proper that were a bit more difficult to control, even in the same Croatia, or at least were sort of similar. So think about Transylvania, some parts of it in particular. But this we will see better as we will complete our series on Transylvania as well. Now, in 1093, Croatian lords elected Petar Snačić, possibly linked to the same line that we know better because we lack the explicit term there. There could have been people bearing the same name, but in any case, this was one of the prominent early noble houses, so he surely belonged to it, as king. With his seat based in Knin, a fortified inland center long associated with Croatian royal authority, Petar contested Almos's influence until 1095 when Ladislaus died, passing the claim onward to his nephew Koloman. King Koloman of Hungary also made a video about him, who had already secured claims through familiar connections and military campaigns, was not seen purely as a foreign conqueror, but rather as a pretender to the Croatian throne by hereditary rights. Consider that the same Hungary had lots of problems in terms of internal power concentration, like also in succession. The Magyars had historically sort of practiced a agnatic line with the precedence given to brothers in succession rather than simply from father to son. This was gradually to become the case, but this is still pretty archaic time, and there is a more traditional understanding that it's the local establishment, of course, that actually allows you to rule, like by respecting their customs and by being especially elected in arms by the Saint to receive support locally. Koloman assembled a large army and defeated Petar Snačić at the Battle of Gvozd Mountain in 1097, killing the last native claimant of Croat descent in a clash that occurred near, in fact, Montanus terrain, as we've seen before, previously contested by Ladislaus. We know very few about these engagements. We'll talk more about medieval Croatian warfare, because I don't think we ever even specifically went into it in a single video, but still. Since the Croatians no longer had a leader and Dalmatia contained numerous fortified towns that would be difficult to subdue, as always, that is a constant in Hungarian history, it was a Central European power, essentially, like not much of a southern one. Negotiations began between Koloman and the Croatian feudal lords. Right? It took several more years before the Croatian nobility fully recognized him. Koloman, however, was finally crowned in Beograd in 1102, assuming the title of King of Croatia and Dalmatia with the full diplomatic name Regnum Croatia et Dalmatia, King of Hungary, thus and Dalmatia and Croatia. Beograd Namoru, we mentioned here as the crowning see, is an important coastal settlement in northern Dalmatia, with historical ties to the earlier Croatian rulers as well, that had different sort of residences, power bases, and served as the site for this ceremonial recognition and emphasized continuity rather than outright conquest in a truly Croatian royal sense. This arrangement preserved core elements of Croatian governance as well. The Sabor continued to function as an assembly of nobles, for example, and the Ban served as the king's representative in local administration. Right? The Banate, this existed also in other parts of the Balkans, gave sometimes even the name in other languages to particular soldiers that came from these places, etc. The band served as the king's representative in local administration. It had obviously also a military function. Croatian laws and privileges remained largely intact, including restriction on military obligations that limited service to within Croatian borders north of the Drava River. That was a bit the main frontier, so to say, with the Magyars, reflecting long-standing customs that prioritized local defense over distant campaigns in particular. Naturally, Croatia, as we've seen in its development, was actually an important polity, but it could not compete with the Hungarians, and in fact had always sort of been on the defensive. So even the obvious military contributions exacted by the Magyars mostly revolved around specific retinues of sort of princes that were essentially taken hostage, sent at the Hungarian court, etc., rather than some deep sort of local militia moving across sort of the reach of what was de facto was a Magyar empire, right? And this is also an age of rapid feudalization for local standards, increasing the power of the elites, of the aristocracy. The agreement between the Croats and the Magyars, whether documented in the form later associated with the Pacta Conventa or through unwritten understandings, ensured that the 12 noble tribes, including the Šubić, Kačić, Guzić, Kukar, Lapčan, Mogorović, Tugomirić, and others such as the Chudomirić, Yamonet, Lasničić, and Poletčić, retained their possessions without interference. Right, so they were essentially parceling out Croatia among these local noblemen, provided in fact the alliance, the subjection essentially to Hungary, however you want to see this. Again, it would remain for the loose in the nominal respect of the local customs. These 12 noble tribes we just mentioned, by the way, were collectively known in Latin sources as the Nobiles Duodecim Generationum Regni Croatia, representing a core group of ancient Croatian lineages whose territories span from the Kupa River northward to the Neretva southward, and from the Adriatic hinterland to inland Županije, granting them exemptions from certain taxes or tributes while obliging them to provide armed horsemen for defense up to the Drava, at their own expense in that case, with the king covering costs beyond that point. All right, it seems fair, obviously. And this affected also the same organization, because again, some militias won't even be of use beyond such distances. The Pacta Conventa itself, whose earliest manuscript dates to the 14th century and appears as an insertion in works like the Historia Salernitana by Thomas the Archdeacon of Split, is widely regarded by historians as a likely forgery from that era, possibly a 14th century addendum or a rework that essentially traced contemporary relations back to 1102 to legitimize noble privileges amid evolving power dynamics. Nevertheless, its contents largely correspond to the actual political situation of early 12th century Croatia. That would have not been, in fact, different in substance, that there were other countries having similar relations with one another, by the way. It reflected a non-written accord that regulated the relations between, again, the kingdoms, allowing the Croatian nobility, as we've seen, to retain its laws and privileges, including the restriction of military service owed to the king within the boundaries of Croatia. Croatia also maintained its own consuetudines antiquae Croatorum. These were ancient Croatian customs distinct from the Hungarian consuetudo Hungaricalis. These customs appeared in later wills, bans, orders, and statutes such as the Vinodol, Polica, Novigrad, and Vrana codes, which codified local practices in areas ranging from the Kvarner Gulf to inland estates and preserved separate legal traditions, even as Hungarian customary law exerted some influence. a distinction still noted in the Tripartitum of 1514 by Istvan Verboci, the comprehensive Hungarian legal compilation that explicitly acknowledged Croatian distinctions. And so from documents like testaments, other kind of transactions, etc., we can reconstruct obviously the type of customs themselves and what to which in fact system they belonged, even though there was some level of in fact customization depending on the will of single rulers to a degree. It was a largely personal practice. There wasn't such a thing like, 19th century nation-state code. In 1105, Koloman granted specific concessions to the Dalmatian maritime cities in exchange for their submission. Typical, once again. These cities could elect their own bishops and priors, subject only to royal confirmation, while Hungarian settlement within urban areas was prohibited, and the cities were freed from direct tribute, although royal agents supervised customs collection without interfering in internal politics, thereby balancing royal oversight with local autonomy in key ports like Split, Trogir, and Zadar. Naturally, this was an admission of lack of power, in any case, in these areas. The important thing was to recognize Hungary as overlord, so also internationally to lay the foundation on of a later Hungarian re-expansion at some point, especially considering that the Venetians were starting to be ever more powerful in the area and normally had the upper hand on it. The diplomatic name of the kingdom remained Kingdom of Croatia and Dalmatia until 1359, when the plural form kingdoms Regna came into use after Louis I's victory over Venice and the Treaty of Zadar. Right, we've seen this in the series about the medieval Hungary. This were at the time of the Angevin dynasty. This name was often referred to in the singular until Venice regained much of the coast in 1409, with, in fact, synonyms including Sclavonia or Tota Sclavonia, with the common Croatian, while the common Croatian form was Hrvatska Zemlja, right? So Croatian land proper, underscoring a persistent sense of territorial and cultural unity, at least at a local level, against especially like those powers that were not to recognize that local identity, right? This would be a contentious question until the 20th century, until today, in a sense. Like, given that, of course, there were also some Romance speakers already from since antiquity in Dalmatia, and then partly Slavic elements, and later the further Italian elements, and also some Slavs that identified with that. We've seen it fairly well in the video about Ragusa, as a matter of fact, so we will come back on these topics. Now, geographically, the Kingdom of Croatia was bounded to the west by the Dalmatian coast, from the headland of the Kvarner Gulf to the mouth of the Neretva, to the east by the courses of the Vrbas and Neretva, and to the south by the lower Neretva, and to the north by the aforementioned God's Mountain, the Kupa River. The term Dalmatia initially referred mainly to coastal cities and islands under varying degrees of Roman, Byzantine, and later Venetian influence, and only spread further inland with later Venetian expansion, while the core, again, of the Croatian realm emphasized this inland Županija administered according to customary law. The realm was ruled by a ban, thus acting as the king's deputy of formal. After 1198, dukes of Croatia offered junior Arpads such as Andrew II, because this is what the personal union consists in. It's basically that the king of Hungary is also king of Croatia, with Croatia not being part of the Hungarian kingdom, governed thus in a semi-independent way, with a ban that could be still of Croatian origins. These were in any case major noblemen under them. In fact, there is all a list of Croatian bands also in later history, in the modern era, that is really worth appreciating. Perhaps we can make a video on them at some point. And this is partly about them. From 1225, the territory was occasionally divided between the Ban of Croatia and Dalmatia and the Ban of Slavonia. There were two different figures, though the positions were later merged by 1476. The land was organized in, again, Župani, administered by hereditary local noble counts, the Župans, who ruled according to their ethnic law. Church jurisdiction was split. South of Gods fell under the Archbishop of Split, whose see held long-standing metropolitan rights over much of Dalmatia and Croatia proper, dating back to the early medieval synods, while Slavonia came under the Archbishop of Kalocha in Hungary. Reflecting this dual world, dual ecclesiastical influences within the Union, right? A Central European, Southern European one. Throughout the 12th century, the Union faced persistent challenges from external powers contesting control over Dalmatian coastal centers mainly. Ottoman, as we've seen, had brought most former Byzantine coastal cities under control by 1107 after allying with Constantinople against the Normans that were the rising star here, and who in fact were strongly infiltrating into these lands. At some point there were some Slavs that went over to Italy to fight for the Normans, and there was a lot of piracy along the coast in particular, and so there was a blend of all kind of factions there. The Hungarians thus had granted the Dalmatian towns autonomy also to defend themselves from these kind of issues, because they wanted to maintain their own independence, if anything. Hungary was granting their own autonomy by constitution, as we've seen. And the Magyars sent troops over Dalmatia and also installed Hungarian bishops in places like Split and Zadar, which sparked local revolts at times, because obviously these people did have, in any case, some sort of heavy hand on local affairs. There were partisans on both sides, and so there wasn't like a simple appointment, whatever. It was a much heavier political interference. Venice, determined to protect her commercial dominance in the Adriatic with its extensive trade networks linking the Mediterranean to Central Europe, launched repeated incursions in Dalmatia. In 1116, shortly after Koloman's death, Venetian forces defeaed Ban Kledin and seized Beograd, Split, Trogir, Šibenik, Zadar, and several islands. Right, the Venetians are also, actually in strictly maritime terms, by far the most traumatically aggressive and rampantly expansive power at this point. King Stephen II of Hungary responded in 1117. Although the Venetian Doge or Delato Faliero fell in battle himself near Zadar, a 5-year truce left the status quo largely unchanged. Renewed fighting in 1124 allowed Stephen II to reclaim Beograd, Split, and Šibenik, but Zadar and the islands remained Venetian until the Doge Domenico Michele reasserted control in 1125 and razed Beograd. By 1133, during the reign of Baila II, Hungary had recovered most Dalmatian holdings except Zadar. Byzantine involvement, as we were saying before, during the Komnenian era added further complexity, as Emperor Manuel I campaign in 1167, after essentially the defeat of the same Magyars inland, brought areas south of the Krka River in Bosnia under imperial oversight, installing a governor in Split amid efforts to reassert influence in the Balkans. Ban Ampudie briefly liberated parts of the region through a local uprising, because the Byzantines had already been spreading there. It happened the year before. But in fact, Byzantine forces prevailed at Zemun in 1167, which is also the same year in which, again, the Magyars as a whole take that beating. This arrangement lasted until Manuel's death in 1180. As you know, Manuel had tried and almost succeeded in the conquest properly of southern Italy, at least the destruction of the Siculo-Norman kingdom, and that would have obviously had major repercussions on on Dalmatia as well. That, as you understand here, was not overall happy of this, right? Aside from the role of the Venetians, whoever closed the straits of Otranto was considered like, of course, a threat to any Adriatic power. After the death of Manuel in 1180, these Dalmatian territories, and also some others controlled by the Magyars, reverted to, in fact, Hungarian-Croatian control. Venice maintained its grip on Zadar in the meanwhile, as well as Trogir with their islands until 1172. These contests highlighted the strategic and economic value of the Adriatic littoral, where trade routes and maritime interests frequently collided with political claims. Zadar rebelled against Venice on multiple occasions and was famously sacked by the Crusaders and the Venetians in 1202 during the Fourth Crusade. Despite King Emeric's pledge to join the crusade, remaining under Venetian rule with only brief interruptions until 1358. Right? If you're interested, I made a video about the Latin sack of Constantinople that talks about also the one of Zara in the process. This all had naturally deep consequences. The diversion in Dalmatia of the Fourth Crusade strained relations across Christian Europe. Also because, as you know, the Croats were historically fiercely, proudly, and violently Catholic. Right, so they had a deep connection with Rome since a very early age, differently from the Serbs that had, as you know, stuck to Constantinople. Even though there are actually much more Latin infiltrations in the Balkans than historically than you think, also during the Middle Ages. We saw this in videos about the local warfare, as a matter of fact. Italians, Germans were the stronger influence here. The arrival of the Knights Templar and Hospitalier, facilitated by grants from Bosnian Ban Boric and later royal donations, introduced new ecclesiastical and military elements into the kingdom. Right? This is obviously exactly that age of full feudalization, and again, Croatia is very Western influenced in the region, and there is probably an expansion of a truly imperial Catholic traditional way to the divinity that is incarnated by these orders as well. The same Hungary historically had been settling lots of Latins in their lands to counter especially the local ethnic oligarchy, as you know, mostly knights, but also merchants, prelates, etc. By the late 12th century, the monastic military orders had established properties in Vrana, Seni, and Nova Ves near Zagreb, contributing to fortified monastic networks that supported both defense and land management amid growing feudal pressures as well. Feudalization accelerated during the 12th century under broader European and Hungarian influences. Powerful noble lineages descended from the original 12 tribes consolidated control over entire counties, exercising full judicial, administrative, and economic powers, and thereby distancing local populations from direct royal structures. Right? But the monastic military orders were an important tool in their hands because, as we've seen, Croatia is recognized as a genuine kingdom, and so as such, like, it can't develop internally. Let's say not necessarily monastic states, I don't know, like the Teutonic Order in the Baltic, but something that could not be simply encroached upon even by, I don't know, some such powerhouses like Hungary. No nobility based purely on royal service emerged in Croatia, interestingly enough. It's as if these aforementioned clans maintained themselves, like their own private retinues. There was of course some military class in Croatia, free knights that would also go out there in the world, but the level of local development never quite allowed, not being there properly an ethnic monarch locally, a sense of, okay, let's counter the nobility by establishing something more properly crown tied, because here the crown was worn by somebody who ruled from Hungary most of the times, and or by a Croatian band that was sort of elected from these clans cyclically to avoid one from them, like to simply take over the others. Among the most influential families were the Shubici, the princes of Bribir, the Babonici holding sway in western Slavonia along the Kupa River, the Kachici based between the Cetina and Neretva with a stronghold in Omesh and reputation for piracy along Adriatic shipping lanes, and the Francopani. And there were princes of Kerk controlling the island and the Kvarner region, and Modrush in northern Lika. Supporting families included the Guzici, later branching into the Kuryakovici, Kukari, Lapchani, some we have already seen before, the Mogorovici and Tugomirici. Wars among these houses were, needless to say, frequent. Right, pretty bloody feuds, rivalries. There is all a deep-seated sort of mobster mentality, as we've seen it. You see, the fact that it wasn't much of a stronger local sort of concentrated authority went along with the general decentralization and privatization of these powers, right? That was a way, that was actually a consequence of the loss to Magyar power in a broader hegemonic sense. So that will actually happen to many powers in Central Europe, Hungary included, had lots of problems with its magnates at the detriment of the monarchy, regardless of sort of ups and downs and its effectiveness. In 1221, Domald of Split and Cetina, possibly linked to the Snatchich or Kachich lines and holder of Šibenik and Klis, clashed with the Shubici over Split's hinterland. For example, Domald had earlier seized Zadar from Venice in 1209, was expelled from Split in 1221, allied with the Kachici, briefly regained the city in 1229, and was finally defeated by Marco I Shubic of Bribir in 1231 after further internal Shubic feuds. This is really typical, and it demonstrates the nobility's capacity for independent action, even as royal authority nominally persisted. And again, this is not much of a positive thing in the general landscape. Croatia and Slavonia remained notably decentralized under such local nobles throughout the 13th century, where in fact their power was increasing, right, with feudalization, the sort of knightly culture sort of taking a deeper root, and therefore affirming some broader seigneurial force over the local communities. In contrast to the Hungarian nobility that forced, for example, Andrew II to issue the Golden Bull of 1222, we talk about that, and so like some prerogatives of untouchability, certain aspects of the oligarchs' right. Croatian nobles already enjoyed most of the privileges granted in that document itself. And again, this is a product of actually a country like Croatia that worked less in general, even just by sheer power than Hungary. At least Hungary had this dialectic, and still, as you know, these are also the same decades of the same Magna Carta. There's all a Pactist tradition that different countries eventually will have different outcomes on the longer run, right? But in Hungary, there was a king that had himself felt, and so it's only after bitter struggles with the oligarchs that the latter could get some rights that otherwise would have been mostly maintained or just washed over by the sovereign. Then we are at the beginning of the 13th century. As you know, there is something deeply devastating occurring in these lands in particular. The Mongolian army that invaded Europe at this point was highly varied and ethnically mixed. Ethnic Mongols often formed only a minority of the total force, while leadership, elite cavalry, and corps command in the two-man units stay firmly, in fact, Mongol, primarily for the Borigin sub-clan, along with Merkits and Khitans. We may videos about all these things. And by the way, you can check medieval Asian warfare content in Schwerpunkt. A significant majority of the soldiers were Turkic nomads of the Eurasian steppe, such as Kumans, Kipchaks, Bashkirs, Volga Bulgars, and Volga Tatars, whom contemporary European sources generally identified as Tatars. We've seen also in different videos about them. Some of these Turks had actually, aside from some of them that had been probably ethnogenetically created themselves, so to say, from a political point of view, actually west of the Urals, historically, and were also in fact of European ancestry, had fled probably into the kingdom of Hungary as military colonists under the Magyar monarchy, as refugees escaping from the Mongol onslaught. Right? When you look at the Mongol army, I stress this aspect for showing you how sort of east of Germany, east of Italy, you already have essentially the steppe, like Hungary itself, the Pannonian and plain and the Carpathian basin is the westernmost part of the steppe. And so Croatia was actually deeply influenced by this as well, right? We've seen it in the local sort of Balkan military styles, etc. In the Mongol army, there were at this point also substantial numbers of conscripts drawn from conquered sedentary populations. Even though we shouldn't overly exaggerate about their number, because most of these were probably steppe nomads, but there were, Chinese military engineers from northern China. There were, think about the Iranian peoples like the Khwarezmians, also from the greater Persia, and Caucasians of sort. Croatians themselves had not been sort of that new to that. I mean, the same Magyars had actually come from the Ugric world, and from a deep sort of steppe influence, at least, origin, right? The Magyars were from the forest areas, but still they received great influences from Persia, from the Caliphate, from other peoples. We're not talking about the Avars, the Bulgars that had been around. The 13th century as a whole brought internal transformations alongside these external threats. Feudal structures took even firmer root, as we were saying, leading to the further consolidation of the powerful noble lineages. The Mongol incursions of 1241-1242 severely tested the kingdom's resilience. Right? It was very hard for Hungary as well. After their crushing victory at Moi on the Saja River on April the 11th, 1241, Mongol forces under Kadan pursued King Baila IV into Croatian territory. Right? Many Magyars fled to the west, and so to the lands of Croatia. The Mongols ravaged the Slavonian counties of Požega and Križevci, destroyed Čazma, and burned Zagreb along with its cathedral. The same Baila had sought refuge first in Zagreb, then in the fortress of Klis, Split, and Trogir, and the surrounding islands, leveraging the rugged Dalmatian terrain and fortified coastal positions for safety. In March 1242, the Mongols attacked the Klis fortress, scaling its walls via nearby cliffs after dismounting, engaging in street fighting and looting houses before abandoning the assault once they learned Baila was elsewhere. Right? So you have this famous fortress that withstood the Mongol onslaught. The Mongols split at that point their forces to target Split and Trogir. So they literally arrived in the Mediterranean. Consider that the Mongols entered the German lands. Some reconnaissance parties even crossed the Alps into Italy. So that's the scale of, major emergency in Europe overall. The Papas and the Empire were interestingly responding to this, but also in an incredibly confident way. All right, and we'll make more videos on that. But these other countries in Central Europe in particular were, as you know, pretty hard hit. Poland, Hungary, Bohemia. If we're not talking about the Rus, obviously in Eastern Europe, that's sort of a much more troubled situation even in this one. The Mongols wanted Baila, so they continued their pursuit through Dalmatia. For telling you how west the Mongols arrived historically. Croatian nobility and towns such as Trogir and Rab helped the king evade capture, although Split notably refrained from offering assistance. Right, the mountainous passes of Dalmatia proved costly, the Dinaric Alps, for the invaders. Ambushes inflicted heavy losses and prevented any permanent occupation despite widespread plundering. Of course, the Mongols were not there to stay, right? Saint Margaret, a daughter of Baila IV, was born in Klis amid these events. Contemporary estimates suggest that up to half the population in Hungary and the affected Croatian areas perished from violence or epidemics that followed. This seems perhaps a bit excessive, but it's incredibly important because the Mongol invasions accelerated an autocratization process that is really visible in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, and that somehow, regardless of the capacity of the elites to sort of actually recover, this is especially the case in Hungary, for different reasons we'll explain better in another video. Probably the changes in local culture and society were very pronounced. Like the magnates overall benefited in relative terms over the commoners from these devastations. Many people, mostly peasants, put themselves under sort of further aristocratic protection in order to defend themselves. They also began to be contributing with much greater work to, for example, the construction of now more solidly stone fortified castles and other contributions that significantly expanded seigneurial authority locally. The invasion prompted the significant defensive reforms. Baila granted Gradec a royal charter in 1242, proclaiming it a free royal city. It was co-opting the local gentry, essentially. And so even in the city, like bringing to a process of oligarchization and spurring the construction of walls and towers. Right? Equally, there are some cities that expand themselves more, others that become more dependent on these. Fortifications became central to royal policy. The king rebuilt the realm, welcomed Jewish families and Cumans for economic and military support, and shifted emphasis toward stone castles as demonstrated by sieges such as the one at Esztergom that highlighted the defensive value against Mongol siege engines. In the following decades, the crown increasingly granted royal lands to magnates as well, on the condition that they build and maintain fortifications. All right, so they were actually expanding their power, but to control them a bit better. This happens also in other parts of Europe, as a matter of fact, but here it's more pronounced. Free royal cities proliferated further. Varaždin received its charter in 1220, Vukovar in 1231, Virovitica in 1230, Petrinia in 1240, Gradec and Samobor in 1242, Križevci in 1252, and Jastrebarsko in 1257. These cities elected their own councils, maintained independent administration and courts, collected their own taxes, and managed local economies and trade, thereby separating themselves from noble authority. This was an effective means of control from the side of the king, right? The Freie Reichsstädte in Germany follow a bit like the same pattern. They had to be stripped wrestled away from the control of the local princes. But as we were saying before, in relative terms, the situation that does improve in terms of at least a more cohesive sense of political and territorial stability, but it's not the fruit of a simple positive, right? This is a general phase of expansion, but it depends also what you do with this expansion, what kind of routes you take politically, socially. Among the new stone fortresses, we have Medvedgrad above Zagreb, along with Garich, Lipovac, Okic, and Kalnik, strengthening the realm's defenses. Feudal consolidation continued after the Mongol withdrawal. The Shubici, Babunici, and other lineages expanded their domains through royal grants or private wars. Internal rivalries persisted in all this. In 1322, Mladen II Shubic son of the powerful Paul I of Brebir, who had backed the Anjou Clement Charles Martel, secured, because as you know, there was an attempt by the local magnates, in fact, not to introduce this powerful sort of scion of the Angevin house of Naples, secured hereditary banship from the Gvozd mountain to the Neretva, styling himself, quote, Ban of the Croats and Lord of Bosnia, extending influence eastward and exercising near independence. Suffering, however, defeat near Klis at the hands of Ivan Babonich. Interesting enough. So you understand how expanded magnate power was at this point and how this played ever more directly, even from Croatian to Hungarian affair. Like local bands were definitely very important people. And in times of crisis like this, obviously there was some autonomous resurgence. The diminished Šubić power and advanced integration of Slavonia, as Paul I had earlier risen as a key oligarch supporting Angevin claims during the Hungarian interregnum following the Arpad extinction. All right, the Angevin arrival. The extinction of the Arpad line in 1301 ignited such fresh succession struggle. Croatian band Paul I had supported, as we've seen, Charles Martel of Anjou, gaining hereditary rights and territories. Upon Paul's death in 1312, his son Mladen II faced rebellions and temporary loss of Bosnia before restoring control. Venetian expansion along the Dalmatian coast accelerated with the capture of Split in 1327 and Nin in 1329. Mladen II alienated Dalmatian cities and nobles through heavy interference. Revolts in Šibenik and Trogir 1321-22 led to an alliance with Venice and his crushing defeat at the Battle of Bliska in 1322 by a coalition that included his own brother Paul II and, as we've seen before, Ban John Babonich. Mladen was at that point imprisoned in Hungary, and Šubić holdings were reduced and divided. Ivan Nelipić then rose as the dominant figure in Croatia. He seized the royal city of Knin, ruled large parts of the territory independently until his death in 1344, and clashed repeatedly with both the weakened Šubići and royal authority. Venice and Bosnia, under Stephen II Kotromanić, took advantage of the power vacuum to annex coastal and inland areas. The Angevin era under Louis I was ascended the throne in 1342, brought centralizing efforts. Also due to the general crisis was spreading further once again. In the 13th century, these countries had suffered Mongol invasions, and the great crisis of the 14th century essentially accelerates those changes that we're just discussing regarding the oligarchization and privatization of power. You've seen here how, again, much more rampantly aggressive magnates are and how sort of compact their holdings appear now compared to the earlier 12 families. They were still like that, but they were much more feudally capable now of also properly ruling at the detriment of the other houses at some point as bands of Croatia. Louis curtailed noble autonomy by appointing primarily non-Croatian bands, often lower nobles of Hungarian origin from Slavonia, interestingly enough, and engaged Venice in a series of wars over Dalmatia. During the 1356-58 war, forces commanded by Ban John Chutz, supported by the Frankopani and other nobles, seized Zadar, Brač, Hvar, and Nin. The Treaty of Zadar in 1358 transferred Dalmatia to Hungarian-Croatian control, stretching from the island of Cres to Durrës in Albania and including Dubrovnik as an independent unit, forcing the Venetian Doge to renounce the title Duke of Croatia and Dalmatia for himself and marking a major restoration of royal authority over Adriatic ports after prolonged contests. All right. The autonomy continued in these areas. However, administration was unified under a single ban now, and economic relative, at least during the crisis of the mid-14th century, prosperity for particular centers followed. In fact, talking especially those Adriatic ports that had made it already from a while over even some others. The struggle with the Venetians had also brought probably to some payments from both sides to adjust this territorial withdrawing, right? Because they could never fully control themselves. That one thing, the Venetians were very good at controlling the coast, and that's all they needed in a sense. Whereas Hungary had to launch major expeditions from the hinterland, right? And the siege of Zadar was a big thing. Like, it cost the Venetians really, like, we're talking millions of ducats even for the single siege. But only the king of Hungary was so powerful to be able to mount up a siege to begin with, an expedition to break off a siege, etc. So it's more like a repetition of spheres of influence with nominal control regained or withdrawn according to the situation. New royal towns appeared along trade routes, merchants gained greater influence, and cultural ties between the coast and the interior strengthened. Louis that in 1382 ushered in a period of instability, however, and overall, again, the picture is not so rosy as it may sound, right? There is, again, a great mechanism of cooptation, further oligarchization. This should not be confused with some sort of boom or whatever. Like, it's some specific leaders that become much more powerful locally. And this facilitates, obviously, the contact with Hungary, but the general picture is very delicate. Louis was a great ruler. His young daughter Mary succeeded under the regency of Elizabeth of Bosnia and faced opposition from nobles who favored Charles III of Naples, right, for dynastic reasons as well. John of Palisna, prior of Vrana, launched the first uprising, allied with Turko of Bosnia, but was defeated. A renewed revolt in 1385, led by the Horvat brothers, resulted in the capture and execution of Elizabeth herself in 1387 after Mary's brief deposition. So this tells you how bloody these struggles really were. Like, as you know, also the Angevins had this kind of issues. The same civil war in Naples where the Hungarians participated, like, was a pretty devastating situation. Probably giving an idea of the terrible temper of the times, notorious, especially these decades, are the wars in the later Middle Ages. Sigismund of Luxembourg, Mary's consort, was crowned king in 1387. Yet that's another major dynastic change in Hungarian history. In spite of that, factional strife continued. Because, again, like, especially in Central Europe, the sovereigns were capable of rising to kingship of these countries, but essentially by brokering power with the oligarchs that were gaining further power, and also, in the sense, undermining further the power concentration capacities of the monarchy. You have Turko I asserting Croatian and Dalmatian titles until his death in 1391 in this period. Sigismund's long reign from 1387 was marked by Ottoman incursions and persistent noble dissent. The Horvat brothers, we mentioned before, Voje Vukcic Vratinic, the most prominent member of his clan, we'll surely make a video about him. Grand Duke of Bosnia, Knez of Donji Kraji, championed Ladislaus of Naples and secured control over much of Croatia and Dalmatia by 1390. Sigismund's military expeditions gradually reasserted royal authority by 1409, quite an important difficulty. Here there is all the, as you know, the issue of Nicopolis, as we will see now, the arrival of the Turks, that greatly upset the same Croatians. Venice, in the meanwhile, reclaimed, however, key Dalmatian centers after Ladislaus sold his claims in the same year for 100,000 ducats. As we were saying before, normally we're just several hundred, to at this point much less actually. 100,000 ducats to forfeit this land properly to the Venetians because of the incredibly difficult situation the same Sigismund found himself in. We've seen this fairly well in the video about the Order of the Dragon, right? And here the Turkish problem was becoming that big that the King of Hungary had to cash immediately. We've seen it also in later history with the Black Army, the need of Hungarian monarchs probably to save their own realm, right? And so starting to pay for all this sort of disintegration of local institutions, like obviously they had always pushed in the opposite direction, but say a terrible mechanism pushed by the oligarchy that would pay in fact for it with the fact of destruction of the kingdom. Now, Croatia, initially a fierce opponent of Sigismund, eventually submitted while retaining substantial influence in Bosnia. He was styled Duke of or Herzog of Split and received the island of Brač, Hvar, and Korčula. He minted coins and acted at times as the de facto ruler or deputy for Ladislaus in Dalmatia. Ottoman raids intensified in the following decades. By the way, a major Croatian defeat occurred at Krbava Field in 1493, where an army assembled by Ban Emeric Derencin was overwhelmed by forces under Hadin Jakub Pasha. This 15th century is fairly foggy, right? But what's the Croatian history, of course, there is a consequence for this general shipwreck of the same Hungarian monarchy as such. And the Battle of the Krbava Field is pretty dramatic. Despite an initial Croatian advance fought with swords, the Ottomans employed a typical feigned retreat that drew the enemy into an ambush from wooded areas in the rear. Similar tactics were being employed, I don't know, even with success by the Albanians against the Turks, for example, further south. But this maneuver in 1493 caused the Croatian left flank at Krbava Field to collapse, surrounding most infantry and inflicting heavy casualties among the nobility in what became locally remembered as the Field of Blood, right? We often forget, again, this Croatian perspective. We mostly think about Kosovo Poliv or the Serbs, etc., but the Croatians would remain on a very, albeit better side of the frontier, right? They're still in a pretty difficult situation for centuries to come. We've seen it in the recent video I made about the general introduction to the Turkish wars. This Ottoman victory obviously brought to great vogue across Croatia. It accelerated the population and the evacuations from exposed border districts while contributing to the decline of the lower and middle nobility as well. So further oligarchization, as we've seen also in the videos about the Habsburgic domains at the beginning of the 16th century where we arrived now. Essentially, the more worried that the Habsburgic government was not particularly functional, say at this time in history, and they were all more often involved elsewhere, but essentially it was mostly the Styrians that subsidized the Croats in order to maintain like adequate military forces, some garrisons, some sort of military colonies at the end of the day on this Turkish frontier, because of course when Croatia was overrun, the Ottomans could reach also southern Germany, northern Italy. And so everybody was a bit, at this point, in fact, the Habsburgs, the Venetians start paying the Serbs, the Croats for resistance against the Turks. You have the Haiduks. We'll talk about all this stuff. But it's a terrible, terrible situation. And Croatia is just on the frontier, right? Derencin himself, by the way, when the Battle of Krbava Field, 1493, had been taken captive, and he died in prison. So just for telling you how humiliating this was for properly Croatian establishment, aside from the bath of blood of the same and the battle. This structured dramatically, like Croatian rule. Bans such as Petar Berislavić, Bishop of Veszprém and elevated to the ban office in 1513, achieved notable success, most famously the crushing victory at Dubica, the same year. That was, in fact, a bit of a revenge and redemption from what had happened 20 years before at the Krbava field. Berislavich worked tirelessly to organize frontier defenses, the ones we were just discussing, with support from the papacy, obviously, of course, and the same Hungarian crown that still existed, like the Hungarian kingdom, in spite of all, was still there. But he constantly struggled with shortages of funds and troops, needless to say. He was killed eventually himself in an ambush at the Battle of Pliševica in 1520. All right. So there was really short breath here for the Croats. Ottoman forces captured Knin in 1522 after earlier failed sieges and continued to undermine southern fortifications as well. As you know, Bosnia is occupied, is also colonized by Muslims, and so that there is a deep alteration of the sort of the regional, ethno-cultural, ethno-religious even background. By 1526, following the death of Louis II of Mohacs, the Croatian nobles assembled at Cetin and elected Ferdinand of Habsburg as their king. The Sabor emphasized that this was a free choice, of course, and it technically was. I mean, it was dictated by the broader situation. Obviously, Croatia was losing autonomous power to be unavoidable. It was starting to depend, in fact, on the major regional Christian power left, at least probably in the hinterland, where the Turks were more dangerous, thereby, however, reaffirming local autonomy and preserving Croatian institutions within the emerging Habsburg framework amid the broader Ottoman threat following this crushing and actually decisive Hungarian defeat, at least as far as the crown was concerned. The Habsburgs had, again, an incredibly complicated governance in their role as emperors and kings of Germany, but in fact ruling over a much more complicated amount of land, all with its local particularisms and autonomies. But also, as we were saying, also a scarcity of resources to directly intervene to preserve it. So again, Croatian autonomy was looked upon favorably at this point by the Habsburgs, very much as these other powers had done before. Like they didn't have really much of a strength to directly control it. They could march on it at some point, but say they didn't have any reason to spend an enormous amount of resources just to control these locals. For what? For imposing their rule, for having them rebelling all the time. It was mostly a matter of, okay, we are, however, the lords that you call to protect you, and so you fall under our senior, our domain. The personal union with Hungary, thus, as we've seen, forged through the 1102 Accords, proved remarkably adaptable in itself. It's not really like an extraordinary success, civilizationally speaking, but it worked for the times and places. It endured dynastic changes from the Arpads until 1301, through the Capetian House of Anjou as cognatic descendants, the Luxembourgs, the Jagellons, and finally the Habsburgs. It weathered feudal realignments, including the dramatic rise and eventual decline of powerful families such as the Shubici, notably, as we've seen, Paul I and Mladen II, who expanded influence as far as into Bosnia, the Kurjakovici branch of the Guzici, the Frankopani, the Nelepici, and the Ratinici under Hrvoje. It also survived repeated external threats from Venice, Constantinople, the Mongols, and above all the Ottomans at the end of the day, whose advance gave rise to the long so-called 100 Years Croatian-Ottoman War. An entire video dedicated to it would be well placed. Throughout these centuries, Croatia retained its administrative legal distinctiveness, the sabor, the ban, its customary law, and the privileges of its nobility, even as its borders contracted under Ottoman pressure and its defense system gradually evolved into the fortified military frontier, the Krajina, right? As you know, means the frontier in many Slavic languages. The Union's fundamental framework persisted, by the way, until 1918. because the Kingdom of Hungary did not technically disappear, right? There were different claimants to it, but the crown was understood to be one. Right? The Ottomans, the Poles, the Habsburgs, the Transylvania. The idea is that the kingdom was still there. So the Croats technically kept participating to that. Also because Hungarian magnates kept existing, as you know, in part mostly under the Ottomans, in part also under the Habsburgs. And this was this terrible frontier where actually the Croats were a bit more loyal, to say the least. Like today, they remained Catholic, for instance, whereas the Magyars converted to Calvinism. And so to the Habsburgs, to the Holy Roman Imperial Endeavor, to the Papal for like they were properly loyal, right? And this mechanism, if you think about it, provided a continuous thread of Croatian statehood institutions despite the shared ruler. And also beyond. Serbia did not have this, for example. Slavonia itself, Bosnia, like they were, something very different. So Croatia actually managed through this relentless efforts at survival, essentially, to literally, in fact, achieve the ultimate goal of standing as a country more than other neighbors had, in fact, ultimately failed to do, right? So I think this is a very interesting history. When it gets to the Croatian one, we definitely made too few. I know that topics are many, and that we really cover in depth so many different parts of Europe. I have also for the original historical series many important chapters incoming, because when it gets to the history of specific, like for example here Croatia, you have the duchy, the kingdom, this personal union of the same, and so it's easier to differentiate in chapters. But how do you discuss, for example, Venetian history without going step by step, almost essentially century after century, right? We must really do this for many other countries. Then there are so many houses, seigneuries, etc. So we really must make an enormous effort in putting all this stuff together and consolidating it further on top of all the other videos that naturally we make regularly on this topic. It's not that easy, but we have arrived at a point in Schwerpunkt's history where you can start finding the unexpected, also in terms of coverage. Sometimes, again, we didn't make enough really for so many different topics, like even some of the most important, perhaps because they're more important, because the question is also how do you narrate them properly, right? But here I'm glad that when it comes to Croatia, I may actually create a playlist on medieval Croatia now, given that we haven't, first of all, and that we have made different videos. Only these ones are so strange. I wonder, wait a minute, because I made a video about Western Balkan warfare. Oh yeah, I understand, because it's not titled Croatia there. Well, in any case, we will insert it as well, because we already have, in fact, enough medieval Croatian kind of content. This is the 4th video. Then there are other polities as well around that. You see here, Bosnia, for example, we recently started a series on Bosnia for the historical original content. However, here we are, in any case. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.